There are moments in history where a single unfinished project does not merely delay progress but actively reshapes the future into something darker, harsher, and more fragile than it ever needed to be. And within the Warhammer 40,000 universe, no failure carries greater consequences than the collapse of the Webway Project beneath Terra, because that failure chained humanity to the warp forever, forcing every voyage, every expansion, and every survival decision to depend on forces that were never meant to be trusted. But now imagine a different timeline, one where that project does not fail, where the hidden war beneath the Imperial Palace is won in silence rather than lost in catastrophe, and where the Emperor does not become a distant, immobile presence but remains fully aware, fully active, and fully in control, because in that single divergence point the Imperium does not merely avoid disaster, it ascends into something fundamentally different, something no longer reacting to the horrors of the galaxy but actively reshaping the rules by which the galaxy operates. And this is not a story about faith or worship or miracles. It is a story about power achieved through absolute knowledge, strategic foresight, and total mastery over forces that once dictated humanity's fate. In this alternate timeline, the Webway Project reaches stability before chaos can exploit it. Magnus never breaches the psychic barriers surrounding Terra, and the labyrinth beneath the palace becomes what it was always intended to be, a secure, warp-independent transit network allowing humanity to move across interstellar distances without exposure to demonic influence, psychic corruption, or navigational uncertainty. And the consequences are immediate and irreversible, because the moment warp travel becomes optional rather than mandatory, the greatest leverage chaos has ever held over humanity begins to erode. As astropaths are no longer pushed to their limits, navigators are no longer irreplaceable bottlenecks, and entire fleets are no longer at the mercy of tides they cannot control, and for the first time since humanity reached the stars, expansion becomes calculated instead of desperate, deliberate instead of reckless, and entirely immune to the whispers that once accompanied every jump through the immaterial. With the Webway operational, the Emperor never ascends the Golden Throne as a prison, instead remaining physically present and strategically engaged, overseeing the Imperium not as a distant symbol but as a living, thinking architect of its evolution. And this changes everything, because his role shifts from emergency commander to long-term designer of civilization, shaping institutions, military doctrines, and psychic development with direct oversight rather than fragmented delegation. And as centuries pass rather than moments of crisis, his influence becomes systemic rather than reactionary, embedding his vision into every layer of imperial infrastructure, until the Imperium no longer depends on belief or fear to function but operates as a machine so refined that resistance becomes statistically irrelevant rather than ideologically suppressed. Chaos does not vanish in this timeline, but it starves, because its power has always depended on access to emotion amplified through the warp, access to psychers pushed beyond safe limits, access to civilizations forced to gamble with their souls simply to survive. And when humanity removes itself from that equation, chaos loses its most reliable source of influence, cult uprisings become isolated and short-lived, corruption loses its momentum, and the great civil war that once shattered the Imperium never materializes, not because conflict is impossible, but because the conditions required for that scale of internal collapse never emerge, and without a galaxy-spanning fracture to exploit, chaos becomes reactive rather than proactive, dangerous but constrained, feared but no longer inevitable. This Imperium does not rule through constant terror, because it does not need to. Its dominance is logistical, informational, and absolute. Webway corridors allow instant reinforcement. Centralized command remains responsive rather than ceremonial, and entire sectors operate in synchrony rather than isolation. Rebellion becomes a mathematical miscalculation rather than a romantic gamble, because there is no delay to exploit and no distance to hide behind, and the Emperor's presence is felt not through monuments or rituals but through systems that function flawlessly, fleets that arrive exactly when required, and institutions that do not decay into superstition because their founder never vanishes from the equation. In this reality, the Primarchs are never scattered beyond recovery, never left to develop in isolation under wildly different conditions, and never shaped by resentment born from abandonment. Instead, they mature as intended, as commanders, governors, and strategic extensions of the Emperor's will, coordinated rather than competing, ambitious but aligned, and without the fractures that once defined them. Their relationships become alliances instead of rivalries. Disagreements remain political, rather than existential, and the genetic legacy they pass to the legions becomes stable rather than volatile, resulting in an Astartes force that evolves through doctrine and experience rather than trauma and dogma. Other factions cannot ignore this shift, because an Imperium that does not decay is unprecedented. The Eldar recognize the danger of a species that has mastered Webway transit without surrendering control. The Necrons encounter a rival whose technological growth does not plateau, and even the Orks find fewer prolonged wars to feed their endless momentum, while Tyranid incursions face resistance that adapts faster than consumption can compensate for. And slowly, inevitably, the Milky Way begins to reorganize itself around a single stabilizing force that does not rely on mysticism, prophecy, or entropy to maintain its position at the center of power. In the end, this is not a story about divinity, belief, or transcendence. It is a story about what happens when absolute intelligence, foresight, and preparation are allowed to reach their conclusion without interruption. Because in completing the Webway Project, the Emperor does not become something supernatural. He becomes something far more dangerous to the galaxy, a permanent solution to problems that once thrived on chaos, uncertainty, and decay. And in this timeline, humanity does not merely survive the darkness of the far future. It defines it, controls it, and ultimately forces the galaxy to adapt to a civilization that never needed faith to rule, only mastery.